You're now experiencing data with Brian O'Neill. Experiencing Data explores how product managers, analytics leaders, data scientists, and executives are looking at design and user experience as a way to make their custom enterprise data products and analytics applications more useful, usable, and valuable. And now, here's your host, the founder and principal of Designing for Analytics, Brian O'Neill.
My guest today on Experiencing Data is John Cutler, who is a product evangelist at Amplitude Software. I have been really enjoying John's commentary on Twitter and some of his articles on Medium about designing better decision support tools. So if you're in this space and you're trying to figure out how do I get into the heads of what our customers need, what types of data is actually important to track, especially if you're looking at longer term outcomes that you want to be able to measure and provide insight on, I think you're going to enjoy my conversation with John. So without further ado, here's my chat with John Cutler. All right, we're back to Experiencing Data. And today we've got the Cuttlefish, as your Twitter handle is known, right? Is it Cuttlefish or Cuttlefish?
We're going to go with Cuttlefish. Not
Cuttle. That's what I thought. John Cutler is here from Amplitude Software, which is a product analytics company. And I wanted to have John on today, not because he is cute necessarily, but because I've really been enjoying what you're espousing about customer experience and particularly product management, which for some of our listeners that are not working in tech companies necessarily, there's not really a product management kind of role explicitly by title. But I think some of the, as you will probably account to, the overlap between design, user experience, and product is sometimes a gray area. And I think some of the things you're talking about are important in the context of building analytics tools. So welcome to the show. Fill in, make corrections on what I just said about what you're doing. You're a product evangelist at Amplitude. So what does that mean, and what are you up to over there?
Well, we're still trying to figure out the evangelist part.
Okay.
Because I don't necessarily sell or evangelize our product. I think our product's great, and I like to say it sort of sells itself. But what I'm really focusing on is helping up-level teams. Now, that could be like our internal teams, our customers, but largely too just prospects and teams that have never even heard of Amplitude. Mm-hmm. And so what we're really looking with this role is to do workshops, provide content. I do these coaching sessions with just random teams. So it's like 1 hour coaching sessions, but generally trying to fill in the blanks. I think a lot of times people think, well, I'm just going to purchase this analytics tool or this product analytics tool, and suddenly it's going to answer all our questions and everything's going to be fine. And what they don't quite realize is that you really have to tweak a lot of things about how you work as a product development team to really make use of the great tools that are available. There's amazing tools available. I believe Amplitude's one of them, but there's so many good software as a service products to help product teams. But really at the end of the day, it's about the team also being aligned and things like that. So I really try to take a broad view of what it will take to help people make better products with this role.
Yeah. Can you give an example? I think I know where you're going with this, but give an example of where someone had to change their expectation. Like, you need to change the way you're working, or let's figure out what's important to measure instead of just expecting. I think you're alluding to like, oh, buy our tool. We know what the important analytics and measurement points are that you should care about, and we will unveil them. And instead, it's like, well, what's important to track? Does time on site matter? Does engagement in the application matter? Does sharing matter? Like, what matters, right? Can you talk about maybe where there was a learning experience?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, maybe a good way to describe this as well is like a lot of the learning, a lot of the questions begin way before the team is kind of unwrapping the problem and unraveling the problem. So a very specific, I'm not sure this answers your question exactly, but I think we could lead into something more specific. But imagine you're a team and someone says, it's the second half of 2018. What's going to be on your roadmap? And you think about it and you kind of know what you know, and you've heard customers tell you things, and the CEO of the company has sort of subtly, but not so subtly hinted he'd really like to see X, or she'd really like to see X. And you put together this roadmap. And at that point, once you've kind of got people thinking that those solutions are the right solutions, and you force that level of convergence, there's not a lot of measurement will not save you at that point, right? Like you've already committed at that point to deliver those things in that particular setting. So one example of a practice that might change to kind of further or amplify the use of measurement would just be not making committing to missions, committing to move particular metrics that the company believes are associated with mid to long-term growth of the company, and commit to those things instead of committing to build features. So, an example, a real world example, maybe for someone's effort, maybe what you're shooting at before is, did they shift from same time on site was important to something else? But for a lot of these teams, it's shifting from build feature X to something like, shortening the time it takes for a team to be able to complete a workflow. And that's the big shift for that
right
company. So it's nothing to something that makes sense, not necessarily even something to something.
One of the themes we talk about on the show is designing for outcomes instead of designing outputs.
Yep.
Because it's very easy to create assets and create code and things that look like they mask themselves as progress and improvement, and they may not actually return any business value or customer value explicitly. So we have to consciously know what the outcomes are that we want, let alone measure them, right? Yeah. Do you deal with do you run into the problem so if you're coaching someone and getting them into this mindset of designing around an outcome and building your sprints or your next, well, maybe it's even a strategy for the next 6 to 12 months around outcomes, that the important things to measure are not quantifiable in the tool? Like, do you work yourself out of a customer sometimes because the tool can't actually measure what's important? Like, does that ever happen?
That's a great question, because I think that I do a fun exercise with people, which is called, let's predict the success of a relationship. Mm-hmm. And we start with this activity, and we just sort of, we forget about what we think is possible to measure, and we just start mapping our beliefs. So the team will say something like, well, I think that they shouldn't have arguments. And then someone will say, well, yeah, but it's not just, maybe they're talking about their own life. Like, well, we argue a lot, but we resolve our arguments we become stronger once we have the arguments. So then, the team will sit there and go, okay. It's not just about the number of arguments, it's ability to, resolve your arguments, right? And so we keep playing this game, and we map our beliefs out to, predicting these things. And some of these things we have more confidence about, and some of these things we don't have a lot of confidence about. Some of these things we strike, and we get this big messy network of nodes and edges on the wall, and that's what we start working with. What's really, really interesting is that we actually, as a company, there's almost always some percentage of these things that we can contribute to in terms of what they can instrument in using our product. So it's not like we would much rather our customers map the universe of things and acknowledge some things that might be difficult to measure, or they're just beliefs at the moment. They haven't figured out how to measure them. Because really, what Amplitude's very powerful at is doing behavioral analytics about these sort of long-standing customer journeys through products. And those types of, anyone who's done like a 15-table join and tried to communicate it to other people in your company and then tweak it and have people collaborate with it just knows how painful that is. And so that's the type of pain that we sort of solve. But, back to the particular question, all the coaching really centers around mapping all the beliefs. And we're usually confident that that there are ways to measure some percentage of those things using our product. And that's fine by us.
So there's almost like a meta question, right?
I'm meta. Yeah. I'm there with you.
You're like analytics. You're an analytics product, and you talk to your clients about what's important for them to measure. But then at some point, you have to know what's important to measure to know that your customers are getting the value. Yeah. So is it directly like, are you interested in what they're setting up to measure? And then that becomes your kind of measurement of, like, do you piggyback off that? Or do you, like, how do you justify that, the sprint or the epic we worked on last quarter provided business value? Like, how do you, as a
yeah, that's
leader?
amazing. So yeah, we definitely dog food our product, and we also dog food the advice we give people, usually kind of first. And to give you an example, like in 2018, we had this North Star metric called weekly querying users, WQUs. And that seemed about right. And, we did some analysis, and it looked like, well, if we're increasing WKUs, it's probably going to mean this and this, and it's going to be some, early indicator that our monthly recurring revenue is going to keep going up, et cetera. But there were obvious problems with that. And we saw that. And as 2018 kind of went along, we started to look at it more. And for any SaaS company, there's a point at which your expansion within existing accounts is, starts to be really, really important in terms of percentage of revenue that you're in. And, we thought, well, is that metric, can you hand WQUs to any new team member and say, move that, or move something that you think moves that, and then be 100% confident they're going to make good decisions? And it kind of broke down after that. So what we did is we shifted to weekly learning users. Now, a weekly learning user is not just someone querying, because you could, anyone who uses one of these tools knows you could just sit there and, query all day and not get an answer. In fact, querying more might indicate that you are not getting an answer, right?
Right.
Not like doing anything with it. So a weekly learning user is actually someone who shares some piece of digestible content, whether it's a notebook, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a chart, and they share it. So, we actually have this North Star, which is weekly learning users. We believe these 3 inputs drive weekly learning users, and those are activated accounts, like they need to know what they're doing. They're broadcasted learnings, which is the ability for the user to attempt to broadcast some number of learnings, and then a metric that is sort of a consumption of learning metric, which is the broad consumption across the organization of that particular piece of learning. So this is all sounds really heady. Like, why would we go to all these lengths to do this? And weekly querying users sounded good. But to us, this really encapsulates a strategy. And I think that that's an important thing that a lot of people from kind of pure analytics backgrounds, or, who are used to sitting with a queue of questions and answering those questions, are maybe not used to the idea of kind of moving towards a cohesive strategy as expressed by a number of metrics and the relationships between those metrics. And that's something that we really encourage our customers to do. It's not data snacking, right? It's not kind of like, oh, I got this itch today, so I'm going to answer this question. That took a lot of work to come up with that. And we're confident about those relationships between those things. But more importantly, it helps any new team member. Like, all you need to do is show a skilled product manager, a skilled designer, or developer even, and say, this is our current mental model as described by the relationship between these things. Where do you want to slot in? What do you have in mind? And that's really, really powerful. So I don't know if that it's roundabout way of saying we take this really, really seriously.
So if I can sum this up, and I'll need you to repeat part of it, but you had monthly querying users. So what I take that to be is, I, the customer using, paying for Amplitude software, a querying user means I went in and I looked for content, or I literally used a search interface to probably look up an analytic or some stat. And you moved away from the number of people doing that and how often they're doing it as a measurement of your company's success, to this 3-stage kind of thing that I heard it included sharing some knowledge. But can you repeat what those, those 3 grains were?
So the North Star is what we call weekly learning users, so WLUs. And those are users sort of performing the behavior of interest, right? Which is sort of, sharing, distributing some piece of content. And then we believe there are 3 inputs that explain that metric, or 3 inputs that we really focus on. One is that the accounts are activated, which are meaning that does this account just have a minimum number of people doing that? The next one is broadcasted learnings, which is sort of like me, is the initial attempt to broadcast the learning. And then consumption is the actual long tail consumption of that particular learning. So let's say it is a story. Like, I sign up with Amplitude. No one's really using it at all because we haven't really onboarded and we haven't really instrumented. We haven't done any of that stuff. Okay, well, then we get that done. So we've activated. We have at least a certain number of users kind of learning some amount. I'm in the tool, I'm in a notebook that is really interesting that I'm putting together that tells a story with data, very interesting about the mission that I'm working on. And I attempt to sort of invite people to that notebook or get them involved. That's the broadcast. And then finally, the consumption of learning would be the kind of the accumulated interactions with everyone with the notebook. If that sounds too complex.
Got it.
But,
No. I
but the whole idea is, and the idea is for people listening, and I think especially folks, designers and other folks, is that they, their experience with analytics might be something very simple, like, what percentage of people used feature or something.
Right.
And what they're not getting is the context, the relationships. And,
right.
What I'm describing here, you could, there's Bayesian belief networks, there's causal relationship diagrams, there's just simple stickies and string on the wall, whatever you want to call them. But we're describing our beliefs as it relates to the data. And I think that that's really important. And for some background too, I'm not a data scientist. I don't have, I've been a product manager and a UX researcher, and that's been my focus for a long time. So, it's not like I'm a pro at this stuff. And even for me though, it grounds me in what I'm working with, and makes my analysis a lot easier.
I imagine you may have some, not resistance, but when you're working with, quote, data people or analytics people or data science people in your staff, like at Amplitude, are there routine things that you wish they would hear that would sink in, or problems that maybe they're not aware of that you think they should be like, we need to look at the problem differently? And maybe you encapsulated that, and that's why you have this 3-stage thing as a reaction to the data snacking mentality, which is, what data do we provide? Great, they have it, now they can eat it. Is that the reaction to that? Or are there other things that, and I'm thinking of our listeners, we do have data scientists and analytics type people. And I'm wondering, if you were to work with them, it's here are the things that I want you to think about here to get our head a little bit out of the tech for a second and into the decision support mentality.
Right.
Anything, what would you espouse or kind of advocate?
That's a great question. I think I can answer it a little bit with a story. So I was the PM for search and relevance at Zendesk. It's support software. So, my background is not in information retrieval or the guts of search.
Mm-hmm.
But very, very early on, working on a team with very, very talented people who data scientists, data engineers, really, at the end of the day. One thing that I very much advocated for is we needed to be able to get everyone in the same room. We needed to get the people who were experts in what I would just call the actors, the support agents or the support managers, or the person trying to get help on their Uber app, right?
Uh-huh.
There's experts in that. There's domain experts. There's also people who are experts in the surface area, the surface, like the interface. There's people who are really, really good at searching or finding information on mobile. There's people who's very good at finding information on, in our case, like the support agent's view in their web browser, right? And then you had our people who were really smart and great at data science as it related to search, and they were great at data engineering, et cetera. And so the main thing that I noticed was that there's just a siloing, and the people on my team were just craving to sit next to someone who understood these other things really well. And I think that for, a lot of the listeners, it's probably, that from a first principles angle. You're kind of like, well, I know that there's a bigger picture here. I know that just, like in our case of searching, we knew that raising the mean reciprocal rank of a search term, where you're searching and where does the person click? Do they click on the second item, the fifth item? In theory, raising that would make a difference. But when we looked more broadly, it really didn't relate to deflection of tickets and things like that. So our traditional metrics, the way we were measuring success is locally related to search. If we broadened our horizon to what makes a difference for the human beings out there who need their support tickets resolved, or the support agents or things, that perspective was so helpful. Mm-hmm. So, what I would say to the folks on listening, it's kind of like, in your heart, you should pair with domain experts and people who know the human problem out there, mm-hmm. and understand the decisions being made. I think organizationally, there's a lot of organizational inertia that discourages that, unfortunately. And so you need to fight for it. So I guess my advice is fight for it, because you know that that's important, and you know that this is not just like a pure data science problem or a pure analytics problem. There's a lot of surrounding information that you need to understand to be able to actually help the business.
Sure, and you're echoing sentiment. I mean, I had a data center from the Broad Institute on, and he was mentioning how much he's like, my work is so much more powerful when I have a great domain expert with me who really knows the space. We met over music. I'm a musician as well, and he was trying to explore creativity in the context of jazz, and he doesn't know he's an enthusiast in terms of in music. He's not a musician, but he's an enthusiast, so he kind of understood some of it, but he didn't have the lingo. And it's just interesting when you look at someone working in that space, trying to answer a question about like, how does creativity work in jazz? And they don't have all that domain lingo. And
right.
Being for a change, being the domain expert, it was fascinating for me to be on the other side, because usually I'm the him advocate, even though I'm not a data scientist. As a designer and consultant, we deal with this all the time. It's like, we got to get the right bodies in the room that know the right questions to ask. And I can smell when the right questions aren't being asked. And it's so powerful. So I totally agree with you on the need to provide that bigger context sometimes, so you don't just.
I mean, jazz is just a mistake played more than once, right?
Yeah. Oh, there's tons of them. There's no wrong notes, just bad choices.
It's very easy for him to create the model for that. You just make a mistake and play it more than once.
Exactly.
And then you go back to the top,
Exactly. Well, even that, like, play the head again. Well, what's a head? Oh, okay. Well, it's just one form of the tune, and they cycle through it and play choruses. Well, what's a chorus? Okay, shit. So, but it's even having that. You can imagine that in a business context. I mean, this was like a fun side project he was working on, but you can imagine that in a business context where you just don't even know what you don't know yet about it yet. And I kind of hear this is happening. There's still in the, especially in the non-tech company space, right? The more traditional companies that are, oh, we have 100 years of data, and we need to go buy some data scientists, throw them at this pile of data, and then magic will come out the other end.
Oh, I think that happens in tech companies too, though. I mean, I think that's like the number of data scientist friends who've been hired in is like some large effort. And then, they're like, yeah, and data engineering was the actual problem.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we spent our first, year there just going around in circles on solving that problem. And then, the number of friends I have who've been frustrated by that dynamic, even in tech companies, I think it's a pretty common, more common everywhere than we would think.
You're listening to Experiencing Data, the podcast that explores how design and user experience make enterprise data products and analytics applications more useful, usable, and valuable. Your host is Brian O'Neill of Designing for Analytics, designer, UX consultant, and advisor to the business leaders behind custom enterprise data products and analytics applications. For more information, visit designingforanalytics.com. If you're enjoying the show, help Brian out by rating it on iTunes. And now, back to Brian.
Tell me a little bit about, so we've been talking about the analytical part of all of this, the quantifiable parts largely, but you have a UX research background as well. And, we talk on this show, we talk about empathy. We talk about the needs to go talk to people, to ask good questions, to ladder up, get into all that. So how does that fit in when you're working on an analytics tool? Can you fill us in on your approach to qualitative research and more the soft, mushy stuff that UX people deal with?
It's interesting. So, for context, I'm not a UX researcher at Amplitude.
Right.
But I've done that in prior environments that required the chops, right? But in talking to teams and doing it, I think that I think so many of the basics apply in the sense that you're really, I mean, to overuse the jobs to be done stuff, you're really, really trying to understand what decision this person is hoping to make. Right? Like you're really, and then what impact that decision has on the rest of the organization and who is involved in it. And I think anyone who's done this knows even as a UX researcher, if I do like a co-design activity with customers related to anything analytics oriented, it's just, we're going to do an Excel mockup, or, anytime you get customers involved with that, it's so easy. If you, either side, and I've been on both sides of this, it's so easy to forget what you were trying to do. Right? Like there's some And I think that has a lot to do with the exploratory aspect of data in general, that we have a gut instinct that if we just saw this stuff organized kind of like this, then it would somehow be valuable for something we have to do. So I think that and I don't know if it answers the question, but I think it requires the same chops, but also understanding that people just have a hard time, users have a hard time talking about what they are looking at and what they're hoping to get out of the data when they're looking at it. Over and over and over. And so I think that really, you have to use like all the tools in the tool shed. To give you an example, like there was, I don't know if you've done these things too. Like I'll do these exercises where it's like, okay, we're revamping the app. It's just going to be this mobile browser with 3 numbers on it. And it's just going to, that's it. That we're not going to have all these fancy charts. We're not going to have all this stuff. And 3 numbers and then 1 piece of sort of narrative advice, like consider this or do this. And I love activities like that from a UX researcher standpoint when I'm working with people, because it really, really forces them to just kind of get out of their own head.
Yeah.
To think about it. So, that's like a common trick, and you probably have a lot more, but I don't know if I answered the question, but it's a lot of the same tools, but I think also you have to really, and it's sort of a job environment, they're making decisions, they're hiring these analytics to do a job, but then with this added layer that I think that people are just they find it incredibly difficult to talk about the numbers that they're looking at.
So when you say it's difficult for them to talk about it, are you talking about their digestion of what's on the screen, or their expression of what's important to them to actually find out? Like, what do I actually want to learn about? Is it
both, really? And that's the thing that I think makes it doubly hard, right? Like, It means that if you show them something, and I think that we can all relate to it too. Like any of us who've been shown some mock or some prototype of information on the screen, like you can see your gears turning. You're kind of having to process it, and then where did this come from? Can I trust it?
Yeah.
There's what is it? We see that all the time just in Amplitude. It's people, our understanding of how people experience some of these querying screens that we have, when you actually ask them to just sort of talk through what they're thinking about as they move through it. I mean, it's so complex.
Mm-hmm.
Data trust, where is the stuff coming from? What data over time, their challenges with certain visualization techniques, even if it's quote unquote the right technique. Well, I just need a radar chart. No, you don't really. Mm-hmm. But that's how they've been, anchored or whatever. So it's just complex. I don't have a fancy answer. It's just complex.
This what you just told me reminds me of you had mentioned you do this exercise, and I'm wondering if it's the same exercise that I've done as well with analytics tools, especially in the context of monitoring applications. So there's some system that's monitoring stuff, and it's supposed to advise you on what should I do next or what happened, something like this. And it's like, instead of thinking about what are all the right stats to do, it's write in plain English, like a prose format. What would be the value that we could possibly show? And maybe we can't even technically do it today,
right?
But it's express the analytics in words, like you should change this knob to 7 instead of 9 because we found out X, Y, and Z happened. And we also think blah, 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 blah. And this is how we know that. And there's your recommendation. It's highly prescriptive, but it's an exercise in like thinking about the customer's experience. Like how close to that can we get to, right? Where I don't have to infer from charts or whatever the data viz format is. How close could we get to something that prescriptive, and then try to kind of work backwards from that? And we probably can't get right to that full prose. Is it something like that where you jump to this kind of conclusion, like value conclusion or something like that?
Yeah, and I do a couple of these like that. Like one is I if I have an Alexa or if I have like a tube of crackers or whatever, mm-hmm. I'm like, this is the interface now. Like you can ask Alexa. Like that's your interface. Right. This is a beautiful future world where you just have your smart person, your smart assistant to do these things. Mm-hmm. And so, similar type of, I think what it does is it creates just enough dissonance to kind of snap people out of just immediately trying to unravel the visualization. which can be, I think all of us do that. I think that's our instinct whenever we look at something like that.
The default next question is, how should we visualize this data that we've captured? That's the itch that we may not be the one to scratch.
Yeah, but I think that's also what we can test with at that point. Like when we've got that need to fill, that's when we can try multiple approaches, I think, to see that. That's my experience. There's that point at which you need to kind of, you go back to the drawing board. Although I would say that depending on the subject, the user in that case, or the person you're working with, some people are really, really good at just kind of the co-design aspect. I don't know your experience with that, but it seems to have a lot to do with what the people do each day and how they think about visualization and stuff. But I've done co-design sessions with people who the next step was, well, let's start thinking about, let's start drawing. Let's start doing some other things to do it. So I think that depends a lot on the background of the people that you're working with.
If you were starting over today, like with Amplitude, is there either not necessarily a feature you would change, but is there something that you would approach differently? So someone says, hey, we have this JavaScript widget, you paste it into all your app or whatever, and we can track almost anything, any activity, whatever. What should we show? Is there something you would change about maybe how you guys went, the process you went about arriving at the current product that you have? That's
interesting. I mean, I wish Spencer and Jeffrey were here to answer, because they're the founders of the company. But, I think that it's funny how products kind of have their history about them. So Amplitude, for example, it was a Y Combinator. The founders didn't go to Y Combinator. They had this fancy like voice app or something that they were working on. And this was actually just their effort. They were like, well, we kind of had this app, and they kind of surveyed what was available. And then just like, what we really need, there's a thing, it's a little different. It's like an event-based measurement thing. We really want to instrument this app and know whether people are using it or not. And so that's kind of that was the founding story. It wasn't their key thing. A lot of the early customers were folks from Zynga or Facebook or other places that like had moved on to other startups, and then they wanted something that helped with the 90% of product questions that they had around retention and engagement and complex behavior patterns. Does this behavior predict this, or is there a relationship between these things? So that's kind of the founding story, these discerning teams that had a fair amount of autonomy and were tasked with kind of working in these environments, and they wanted a product that they could do that with. So when I'm thinking about like what I would change as kind of newcomer to the company, now maybe 5 years on, was it? Yeah, 6 years or 7 years on. I think it's kind of what they're starting to do now, which is interesting. Like this notebooks feature to me is just so good. And it gets away from a traditional dashboard. But with the notebook, it's very similar to a data science notebook. You can weave this story and this narrative, and you can make the charts live, and you can communicate it, and you can do those things. As a product manager, that is pure gold to me. Mm-hmm. And it's just we've started to do those things. So I think that the answer would be more of what they're really digging into now, which is around this learning user concept, and how do you create stories with the data to motivate your team and keep everyone kind of aligned and things. So I think that would have, if it hadn't existed and I joined a year ago, I'd have been like, oh, you're missing this little element, like the actual part that integrates it into day-to-day product development. But they've just started doing that now. So they stole my answer.
Nice. And just for people that don't know, tell me if I got this right, but the notebooks, for people that aren't data scientists, it's effectively a collection of both quant data, like maybe charts or tables, stats, data collection that you guys have put into some kind of visualized widgets or whatever it may be, insights, plus qualitative stuff like my commentary on it. Like, why do we care about this? Well, design is currently tracking these metrics because we're running a study on and we think we can move this up, and that's a proxy for this other thing. So you can provide all this context in that kind of storytelling mentality, so that when someone new comes in, they're like, why do I care about like time on site or whatever the
exactly
metric?
And that's the huge thing. I mean, one thing that we learn, we're in this business of teams getting going. And it's like it's so easy to get to the point where you've instrumented your products, and any new person joining your company can't make heads or tails of anything. Mm-hmm. It's like you've got all these events. They're all are these duplicate events. You've got, we've invested a lot of time in this taxonomy feature, which helps manage your taxonomy. Like, it's way, when people try to build this stuff in-house, they just forget about all that stuff, right? They're like, oh, it's just events. It's like, semi-structured information. We're going to put it here and then we're just going to run queries on it. But like all that's really, really important. So back to the notebooks thing, like one of the biggest use cases we've seen in notebooks is people using them to onboard people and orient them with all the available analytics and metrics and things that are being recorded. So that's actually really good testament to show that need, right?
Oh,
so
they use it to actually show how they use Amplitude at the
right. It's pretty meta, right? Like,
wow. Wow, that's awesome.
So, we see them do that, and it's sort of, or even some have used it for training, like, okay, let's start with this idea that we've got this whole universe of users. Well, how would we segment those? Well, here are the key ways that we segment. Okay, now we've gone down one layer, and so I think that's kind of cool. But yeah, for people who don't know about these data science notebooks, it is a mix of qualitative, quantitative. You can embed charts that are live, or you could embed like point in time charts. You can make comments, and you can do various things. And I think for a lot of people who don't do this for a living, they get intimidated. And it's not this. A lot of the stuff is not rocket science, but it's just annoying to have to go to someone in your company and say, "Hey, could you spend like 3 or 4 hours just explaining our information to us?" Like that's really hard to do. So these notebooks help with that particular thing. So I think that type of stuff is really kind of the future of moving away from just sort of very, very kind of staid dashboards and things like that.
Right. I don't know if there's much in terms of predictive or prescriptive intelligence in the tool. Do you guys, does the tool provide that as well? Or is it mostly rear view mirror kind of analytics?
It's just sort of it's interesting you say that. So we have this new feature called impact analysis. And so in impact analysis, you are able to kind of go from day zero of a particular use of a particular feature and then see the impact that it has on other set of things. And we give some statistics and we give some other values in there, but we're, so we're kind of middle of the road, moving to more and more complex questions. But one thing that our team realizes that anything, it just to prevent people from making bad decisions or making poor statements, you need to be so careful, like about presenting what you're actually showing. If there's like there's a correlation between something, or even implying that there's causation without doing the background on it. So we're not completely rear view, and we're sort of in this middle round, but we're also going to go on record and say, we're predicting what this value is going to be in 6 months.
Right. No, the reason, not just the hype of machine learning, blah, blah, blah. That's not my main reason for asking was going to lead into my next question, which was do you struggle at all with the expression in the tool of the evidence that backs up any types of conclusions that you're showing? Do your customers care? Like, well, how did you guys arrive at this?
They absolutely care. And so like we spent a lot of time in the ability in Amplitude, like any data point that you see, usually if you hover over it, there's a message that says click to inspect, or you can create a cohort off of that, or you can see the paths to that particular thing. So what we really made this effort to do is exactly right, is that people working at 2 analytics companies now, Pendo and now Amplitude, data trust and people being able to unravel what that number means in a way that makes sense to them seems like one of the massive limiters, right? It's just that thing that it's kind of like best laid plans start. That's the entropy that exists with these tools as people use them more and more. It gets messier. Bunch of people are playing around with them. And so at least with Amplitude, they try to make a really big effort to like, if you want to understand why that number is there and what is behind it, we try to make that really easy. But we could always do better because in my mind, this is the number one difference between like the more data snacking approach, like, oh, it kind of looks interesting, that number,
Right.
And something that you can really pin your business on, which I think is what people, that's the dream of all this. But then once people start to ask good questions, it really challenges the tool, I think.
Right. Man, John, it's been fantastic chatting with you. I really appreciate you sharing this with our listeners. Like, do you have any parting wisdom or anything you'd like to share with people that are kind of maybe working in the more on the tech side or the data side of the thing and the fence, and they're trying to, I want to produce more use, whether it's reports or actually software applications, but we're trying to provide better stuff, more engaging, more useful. Any kind of closing advice you might give to someone like that?
I'm kind of going back to what we were talking about from the UX research angle, is that I think that in this area, there's so much temptation to any one of us who've done this, is that there's this constant push and pull between customizability and then this promise of, preemptive insights, like a smart system, it's intelligent, it's doing these things. And then, so, how prescriptive are you? Is what you're presenting actually helping someone to do their job? So I think that it's probably reflective of my learning at Amplitude, is that really going to human-centered design, like really thinking about if the person's able to effectively do their job, and really able to answer the questions that they're answering. I think that what happens is all of us want that. But then we hit this wall and we start to get really some conflating information from users, and then we're like, well, okay, we're just going to let them find what they want to find. And I think that exploratory type of research should be something that's possible in these tools. And in fact, I think that leads to asking some of the best questions when users can do that. But I would really hope that people don't abandon the idea of like being really patient and seeing if, before they just sort of throw their hands up in the air and we'll say, well, we'll just make a query builder and that's it. That's it. Like really seeing if that thing can solve the problem. And something that I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's something that's really been on my mind a lot lately.
Yeah, I talk about sometimes, like with clients and people in this space, about knowing whether or not you're producing an explanatory product or an exploratory product. And it doesn't mean you can't necessarily have some of both, but
Right.
There's a big difference between like the value, like in your case, I'm guessing a lot of these people really want some explanations, like when they like tell us about what we can do to make our software better.
Right.
And they're not there for fun, but they might run across some things they didn't know were possible, which begins the questioning. But if you put all the effort on them, you're just shifting the tool effort over to the customer, right? You're making it that much harder for them to get the value out, at which point they may abandon or quit. So it's not just knowing, are we explanatory or exploratory, or at least is this feature, is this outcome, this goal that we're working on, the sprint? Just being aware of that, I think, is part of the challenge, right? Like, should they be able to walk away with like, I should be in the 6 to 19 apples range, whatever that means. Like, should I be able to walk away with that level of clarity, or not? So I think
that it's also that's interesting you said that, because a lot of features that we're experimenting with, one thing that Amplitude does, it's kind of, anytime we built like an undo feature. So we try to make it really easy to like go really deep and then just kind of back out really gracefully. So it's kind of like infinite. Every version of the chart as you work on one is saved. You can back out of it. There's a lot of like features like save as, or kind of, you're built, like you could go to someone else's chart, and if you have some idea of where you want to take it, you could edit it, but you're not editing their chart, you're editing a copy, and you can sort of think about it. But back to that point is, I think that there's many things that you can do to encourage that you can juggle those needs concurrently, for having definitive things and then also encouraging exploration. So we've found that with our product as we experiment with more. One, I just told you about it, like the ability to like telescope into a metric and then do more exploration around it. Like that didn't exist before. And then we're like, oh, well, how about when you hover over any data point, you allow them to like inspect that or explore that. Mm-hmm. So I would say that there are ways to kind of accommodate both, at least from our perspective, what we've learned.
Right. And I think there's always some of both of that, and I don't think most people are going to take everything on face value.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying. One of the things I've been recently working on is a UX framework for this called the CED framework, which is conclusion, evidence, and data. And it's not necessarily a literal expression of like, where should the screens go? What goes on every screen? But the concept that when possible, if the tool can provide conclusions, with kind of the second tier being the evidence by which the tool or application arrived at this conclusion. And level 3 might be really getting into the raw data, like what are the queries, what was the SQL that actually ran, or whatever the heck it may be.
Right.
There's times when maybe that data is necessary, early on in a customer journey. It may just be, we need to build trust around this stuff. We can't be totally black box, but we don't actually expect people to spend a lot of time at the D level. Like we really want them to work in the C level, but it'll take time and evidence is required sometimes if you're going to, especially I got to go to the boss. Like I can't just tell them it's 8, we should be at 18, not 12. It's like, well, how did you arrive at that?
We find a lot is the instrumentation rigor is like, that's one of our big problems to solve really is, there are these products on the market that do kind of just try to record everything for you. And there's a lot of entropy there. And there's a lot of issues. They're very fragile in some ways. So we as a company definitely believe in explicitly instrumenting these events. But at the same time, like you'd be amazed how many product teams, there's this thing called a user story, right? You write a user story that's from the user's perspective. What are you trying to do? Now you would think that like, okay, well, we'll tack on to the acceptance criteria for any story that, you'll use noun and verb and you'll get these properties and you'll get these things like integrating instrumentation on the product level, not necessarily like, okay, we're instrumenting like how our servers are working or anything, but just what did the user do? That's still relatively new. Mm-hmm. People who've worked in environments that just do that as second nature, they're in another thing. But we find that companies even need to change that approach. So, you mentioned your CED thing. Like, what's interesting is that extends to the UX of instrumenting. So it's pretty interesting from that. You're the user trying to draw some conclusion, you're doing these things, but it's almost like service design in some sense, because you need to like design the approach to even instrumenting the stuff. So it kind of makes your head hurt sometimes.
Yeah. All of this stuff makes my head hurt. But that's why we have conversations. Hopefully we're knowledge sharing and it's like giant aspirin conversations or something. I don't know. But I found it super useful. Thanks for coming on the show. Where can people like follow you? I know I found you on Twitter. I forget how, but what's your?
I mean, Twitter's good. I've installed a Stay Focused app to prevent more than 20 minutes a day on Twitter. So, but you will find me eventually there. I write a fair amount on Medium, and it's pretty easy to find me there.
Okay.
If you just type in like John Cutler product, I have about 400 plus posts on Medium. Some are better than others, but
awesome.
That's the best way or for right now.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely link both of those things, your Medium page and your Twitter up in the show links. And man, John, it's been really fun to chat with you here. So thanks for coming on the show.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Super. All right. Well, cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Experiencing Data with Brian O'Neill. If you did enjoy it, please consider sharing it with the hashtag #ExperiencingData. To get future podcast updates or to subscribe to Brian's mailing list, where he shares his insights on designing valuable enterprise data products and applications, visit designingforanalytics.com/podcast.